Hi everyone, I'm Samir and I'm a health coach. I help people optimize their health by eating more animal foods, basically. There's a link to download a free ebook below. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. It's just a couple weeks old. So today we're going to be reacting to a video from Nutrition Made Simple. This is a guy called Gil Carvalho. I think I may have reviewed one of his videos before, but I may not have. I don't really remember. This one was about human evolution, and I know he's going to be very wrong. So let's see. I haven't really looked at it in any detail. Let's see what he has to say.
Did, that's probably the healthiest, right? I mean, it's evolution, right? I hear this logic every single day. I mean, it's everywhere online. It's really, really tempting. I mean, if my ancestors ate something for millennia, then maybe we're adapted to it. Maybe it's natural. Don't get me wrong. There is some truth to it.
So why does he put natural in quotes? I'm a little confused. So if, for example, someone wanted to start feeding, actually we do this, we feed grains to pets, right? But I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, like if you gave your cat a bowl of oatmeal and didn't process it and flavor it with fish or whatever, it wouldn't eat it, right? The cats have to eat meat, right? Cats are hyper carnivores, so are humans for that matter. They have to eat a diet of 70% meat in order to have optimal health. I'm not saying they couldn't survive on other things, but that's what they eat in the wild, and what they eat in the wild is what they're going to thrive on, right? This just makes sense. So I don't know why this guy's putting the word natural in quotes. That's pretty weird.
Example, ultra-processed foods, things like soda, candy, refined grains. They're problematic because we weren't built to process that stuff. Cavemen didn't have junk food. But then people take this logic and they try to extrapolate and they go too far. For example, there's this idea out there that our ancestors didn't eat whole grains, things like oatmeal, barley, rice, so therefore these things must be bad for us. First of all, the facts are just wrong. There's archaeological evidence that we've been eating whole grains for a long time. Barley for at least 20,000 years, oats for 30,000, and sorghum, that's another grain, for at least 100,000 years.
So I haven't looked in, I know some of the papers he's referring to, I won't pretend to know all of them backwards and forwards, but almost all of the data on plant food consumption and grain consumption prior to about 10 or 12,000 years ago, yes, it exists. But you look at those specific cultures, they died out very quickly, sometimes with terrible dentition. That's how we can usually tell that their health was bad, is because, you look at the fossils of the skulls and they just have terrible teeth. The teeth are falling out or they don't have teeth and so on. So without giving us more details about the specific cultures he's looking at, it's hard to form conclusions. But yeah, it's true. Humans have been using plants in general and grains in particular as fallback foods for when there's rough times for about 100,000 years, maybe a little bit longer, but I kind of doubt it.
Now, our species, Homo sapiens, we're about 300,000 years old, give or take. So we've been eating whole grains for a large chunk of our existence.
So what he's saying is actually, if you know anything about evolution and biology and paleoanthropology, what he's saying is basically irrelevant, because, physiologically speaking, we haven't changed in those 300,000 years. So the question is not, what have we done in the 300,000 years? The question is, what got us to the 300,000 year mark? What did we do to evolve into whatever we've evolved into? What were we eating at that point in time? And it's pretty clear what we were eating was a whole lot of meat, right?
Maybe even all along. Okay, so our ancestors did eat grains after all. But does that even...
Some of our ancestors may have eaten some percentage of grains, but when we look at the overall nitrogen isotope analysis in papers that I've cited elsewhere, especially one by Mickey Bendora, I can cite again here, we find that our ancestors, even those who were eating some grains, were eating the majority of their food was coming from animal sources.
Matter? Not really, no. The health value of...
So why on earth, like in what planet does it not matter what food an animal has evolved to eat? In this case, a human animal. Like, what are you possibly thinking to make this argument?
Food is not determined by whether cavemen had it. The fact that our ancestors ate something in the Stone Age doesn't tell us anything about the long-term health.
So they're showing this primitive depiction. It's an artistic depiction. I'm not going to pick on it, but our humans, or the ancient humans, cavemen, if you want to call them that, were exactly identical to what we are today. We haven't changed in 300,000 years, except that our brains have gotten smaller in the last 10 or 12,000 years since we've been eating more plants. So, if anything, those humans were more sophisticated, were more intelligent than we are, right?
The facts of eating this food for 60, 70, 80 years. Cavemen had tiny life expectancies compared to modern times.
So this is a fallacy. I mean, first of all, we don't have data. We can't do a poll. We find individual fossils, and we do find fossils of people who are quite old. Individual people are quite old. Now he's right. He's probably right. I can't say for sure because, again, we don't have data, but he's probably right that the average life expectancy was short, maybe in the 20s or 30s, because a lot of people were dying maybe in childbirth. Certainly we know In the last 10,000 years, this has been the case, that a lot of people were dying in childbirth. A lot of people were dying from infections. A lot of people were, falling out of trees and being hunted by cats and so on, and killing each other as well. So a lot of things were going on, but it certainly is the case that some humans from the Paleolithic age were living to their 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even beyond that.
Our main causes of death, at least in the Western world, are things like heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, strokes. Caveman didn't even make it to the ages where you got to start worrying about those.
So, like I say, that's false. And not forget about cavemen. We have data that these diseases only really started to take over in modern populations in the last 100, 150 years. Were people only eating as much meat as Neanderthals 150 years ago? No, of course not. There are things we have introduced in the diet in the last 100, 150 years, seed oils being top of the list, sugar as well, other refined foods, that have introduced these diseases. So what he's trying to say is that ancient humans didn't live long enough to get those diseases, which is false. Some ancient humans, today, not everyone lives long enough to get those diseases. And some ancient humans definitely lived long enough to get those diseases. Not all of them, but some did.
Diseases. So a diet that gets us through our 20s and 30s tells us nothing about our chances of making it to 90 and dodging a heart attack.
True, but I mean, an evolutionary appropriate diet does tell us that, right? You can look at what humans evolved to eat, right? Not what humans happen to be eating, but what humans evolved to eat. And you can actually assume, unless you can do a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials, you can assume that what we evolved to eat is going to be our optimal diet, or our diet for optimal health.
If we had come up with whole grains yesterday, it still wouldn't matter. So our ancestors didn't eat whole grains, hypothetically speaking, right? So what? They also didn't take antibiotics when they had an infection. We make decisions based on risk-benefit analyses, on pros and cons, with the best information that we have, not based on a speculation from 100,000 years ago.
So what I'd say is he's absolutely right on this. We make decisions on a risk-benefit analysis based on the information that we have, and we have to treat that information with a little bit of humility. If we don't have conclusive proof that a specific way of eating is healthier than another, we have to resort to the presumption that the evolutionary appropriate way to eat is the correct way to eat. Does that make any sense? So we don't know. What he's about to say, I'm sure, is that, we have evidence showing that oats and all these things are good. I would say with nonsense. We don't have such evidence. What we should have in the lack of such evidence is some humility. And what that humility should lead us to is to say traditional human diets. I don't really care too much if you're going to have a traditional human diet that includes some plants, but all traditional human diets had meat. Most of them had a lot of meat. That's the way to go for optimal health. Right? And certainly the data would indicate that you're not going to fail with that approach, right?
Whole grains are consistently linked to lower risks of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, inflammation.
So this is epidemiological nonsense. And you can see right there the word association. Association does not tell you what to do, right? It just tells you probably that people who've been told to eat whole grains because they're healthy are people who take care of their health, right? So it's not really anything to do with causation. It may be inverse causation, if that makes any sense.
And mortality. And according to the massive global burden of disease study, not eating enough whole grains is one of the main causes of disease and death worldwide.
Yeah, so that study cannot inform on that question, right? It just simply is not powered to inform on that question because it's not a randomized controlled trial, right? Show me people who are eating ancestrally, meat-heavy diets, and show me people who are eating lots of oats. I mean, you don't have to show me. To be honest, in my practice, I know what that looks like. People who are eating lots of oats are sick, are going to get sick by the time they're in their 40s and 50s. So what he's talking is complete nonsense.
So the risk-benefit analysis on whole grains is pretty darn clear. The best evidence we have strongly points to eating them. Now, we're talking about whole grains here. We're not talking white bread, white pasta, pizza, candy, pastries. We're talking barley and wheat and wild rice and quinoa.
That stuff, a lot of that stuff is not going to be digested. And if it is digested, it's going to take away important minerals with it, right? It's going to chelate iron, it's going to chelate zinc, it's going to give you deficiencies in the long term. So if you want to eat these things, more power to you. Do what makes you feel good. But, unless you're eating them with like organ meats every day, which sounds a bit rough. Liver and quinoa sounds like a pretty rough combination. But if you're going to do that every day, then I suppose you might be okay. If you're not going to take a kind of very nutrient-dense strategy, you're going to run into deficiencies sooner or later. Most likely. Maybe you're lucky. Maybe you can, you're one of the people who's less affected by chelation and you can convert the vegetable form of vitamins into the usable form. Maybe. But if you want to be safe, this is definitely bad advice, what he's giving you.
What if you're gluten intolerant? Well, then you want to stay away from wheat, barley, and rye. Those three. Everything else?
So gluten is a lectin, and lectins are in pretty much all of these grains. So, yes, gluten is one that can kill people with celiac disease and other forms of gluten intolerance. But all of these lectins are going to damage your gut a little bit. So, I mean, I don't know why you would want to damage your gut a little bit. If you want to, by all means, eat them.
Up for grabs. Another situation where this caveman fallacy gets misused is cavemen ate a lot of meat, so therefore it must be good for us. It's bad logic for all the reasons we just talked about. Some cavemen ate a lot of meat, some ate very little.
That's not true. I haven't come across populations that ate what I would call a little bit of meat. In fact, there's increasing data that Neanderthals, for example, so every human has some Neanderthal DNA. We're all part Neanderthal. Neanderthals ate like an unbelievable amount of meat, much more than we could imagine. And I'll put a paper on the screen that shows that here.
The modern scientific evidence says we don't need meat. If we really want to eat it, we can have some. It's compatible with health. Ideally,
so this you don't need meat thing is like, for what you don't need meat? You don't need meat for some people may not need meat to, may be able to avoid deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies without meat. That's probably true. But it's probably also true that, including meat, if those people ate more meat, they'd actually be thriving better. They'd be closer to optimal health, right? So you don't need meat for what? You don't need meat to avoid deficiencies? Maybe some people, not me, right? But if you're talking about optimal health, I would say, we don't have data. And to the extent that we do have data, it seems to show that, we have data from cultures. And the data that comes from cultures is that all cultures included some meat. So I think it's going to be very hard to argue that you don't need meat for optimal health. In fact, impossible.
Go easy on the amounts, eat it here and there, not as a staple, not as a pillar of the diet.
No, man, eat meat as a staple, as a pillar of the diet. That's what we evolved to do, right?
Ideally, we want to try to get most of our calories, including protein, from whole plants.
Absolutely not. And for a number of reasons. I mean, plants, you can look at the video I did recently evaluating a vegan day of eating, high protein day of eating. When you look at the digestibility and the availability of those amino acids, they're far from optimal. So you have to eat so much plant protein to be the equivalent of a small amount of animal protein, just in terms of the calories and the insulin spike and so on. You're putting yourself in a very bad space. So again, whatever this guy says, if you do the opposite of it, you'll be in great shape.
Regardless of what the Flintstones did. Bottom line.
So again, we're making fun of this stuff based on our theoretical, hypothetical understanding of what our ancestors look like. We don't have that understanding. It's not very clear. And like I say, if anything, they had bigger brains than we do. That much is clear, right? So they were more sophisticated than us. So, making references to the Flintstones and stuff like this, it's just silly. I mean, he's just making himself look like an idiot.
Decide based on your preference, what you like to eat, or decide based on evidence, whatever floats your boat. But don't let anybody tell you that you have to eat XYZ because somebody waving a club was doing it 100,000 years ago. Who cares? That's not evolutionary science. It's just speculation.
So listen, I'm not telling anyone they have to eat anything. I mean, what is your goal? Is your goal to optimize lean muscle mass? Is your goal to reverse your autoimmune disease? Is your goal to improve your mental health? If so, then yeah, you could probably benefit by eating a lot more meat. If you want to be, no energy and sluggish and not feeling great, then feel free to continue being plant-based. No issues.
If anything, I'm biased in favor of evolutionary explanations. Like any biomedical scientist, evolution permeates every aspect of my work. I've published entire papers discussing it. Evolution is crucial, which is exactly why we don't throw it around when it doesn't make sense.
But it makes perfect sense in this scenario, right? I mean, we're talking about what an animal evolved to eat. Like, this is not a difficult conversation. Like, it's the animal, what can I tell you? I mean, a brown bear evolved to eat, for example, salmon and berries going into the hibernating season, right? That's what they evolved to eat. If you take that bear out of its environment, which we do, we put them in zoos and so on, you have to find foods that are as close as possible to what it's going to eat if you want it to behave as it behaves in the wild, if you want it to be in optimal health. And we know this because when you put them in zoos and you feed them other things, they're not in optimal health, right? Now, maybe in some future day, we may be able to, engineer a bear vitamin package, which will, be just as good as the wild diet. But we are very far from that scenario, even for bears, and much, much further away from it for humans. So until we have the answers, which this guy pretends to have, he doesn't have the answers. Until we have the answers, eat the evolutionary appropriate food, which is a lot of animal foods, if you want optimal health. If not, hey, it's your loss.
At the end of the day, nutrition science is not that complicated when you eliminate the distractions, the noise. I don't make these videos to tell people what they can.
So nutrition science is terribly complicated because biology is terribly complicated, right? As I assume this guy knows. It's not, none of this is easy questions. which is why we have to fall back. We have to be humble. We have to have some humility and say, look, we don't have the answer, but based on our testing, based on nitrogen isotope analysis, this is what humans were eating. They were not eating exclusively meat, by the way. They were just eating a whole lot. They were hypercarnivores. They were eating 70% or more of their calories were coming from meat. So if you want to live like a wild human, if you want to optimize your health in the way that we evolved to, that's what we're machines that were not evolved to do whatever we're doing here. We evolved to do some pretty specific things. And in order to do those pretty specific things, we had a pretty specific diet. And if you want to optimize your health, you probably have to find something close to that diet.
And cannot eat. I'm not a guru, and I never want to be one. There's plenty of advice like that out there. Here's the list of foods you can have, and here's the list that's off limits. That's not me. What I think is really interesting, and
this guy is weird, man, because he's clearly vegan biased nonsense and plant-based biased nonsense. But he always puts stuff into his video to say, that's not my bias. I just want what's real. But meanwhile, cherry picking data, which shows what he wants it to show, right? So for, the example of the oats, 100,000 years ago, or the sorghum 100,000 years ago is one example. I mean, I have a paper that I could show here of people eating acorns 60,000 years ago. And, that was a really, really miserable experience, right? And this paper is about the miserable experience. It's not about, if you read some of these other papers, they're like, oh, look, we found oats and so on. Okay, but what happened to that society afterwards? Because as far as I can tell, looking at all of the evolutionary data consistently, plant foods in general, and these grains and seeds in particular, are fallback foods. When humans cannot hunt for whatever reason, seasonally, or maybe there may be some climatic event which has destroyed the prey, then they turn to these crops, right? And this is a long history going way back long pattern going way back in history.
important is that we learn to reason for ourselves on this topic, so we don't fall prey to bad advice and bad
bad advice like you're giving, man? You're giving terrible advice.
Logic and end up hurting ourselves. You don't need to be a professional scientist to understand the basics and to be able to make reasonable and healthy decisions for yourself and for your family. I'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, I totally I totally agree with the last bit that he said. Look, as I said numerous times during this, we do not have the answers. I would be lying to you if I said I knew exactly what the optimal diet for your health is. I don't. I can't prove it scientifically. There haven't been randomized controlled trials done on identical twins over the span of their lifespan. Someone eating a vegan diet, someone eating a carnivore diet, someone eating somewhere in between. That's unrealistic. That's unethical for all kinds of reasons. We're never going to have that data. So in the absence of that data, what are we supposed to do? I think we should have a little bit of humility and say, look, no one knows the answers. And therefore, when we look at historic diets prior to 150 years ago, when all these problems started to happen, which is what he's talking about, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, etc. If we take any of those traditional diets and maybe tweak them a little bit, because we have to tweak them. Why? Because we're kind of sick and we're going to heal with animal foods and meat, right? So tweak them a little bit, go heavier on the animal foods if you need to heal. If you don't need to heal, you can eat exactly what your grandparents were eating, no issues. I think in that regard, you're going to do that's going to be a much, much safer, a much, much healthier, a much, much do no harm kind of approach than what this guy is telling you. You don't need to worry about what evolution designed you to do. I mean, I think that's really terrible advice. So with that, I'm Samir. I'm a health coach, PhD student. I'll see you next time.